So I hope I did everything right. With that, I welcome everyone to the first and inaugural Illusion Horror Con 2022. And I'm very honored to have such an amazing guest selection, not only in this spot, but also in the parallel spot that is running currently, with Seth Skirkowski and Jacqueline Drix. And without much further ado, I would like to ask our honored guests here to give a brief introduction about who they are and what they do in the realm of horror writing and horror RPG gaming. Starting with Matthew Dawkins, just above.
Hello. Hello there. My name's Matthew Dawkins. I'm a writer and developer of tabletop RPGs. I work for a number of companies and have written for a number of horror games. Horror tends to be my genre. Vampire the Masquerade, Call of Cthulhu, Cult Divinity Lost. They came from beyond the grave just there, though I do certainly venture into other genres occasionally. I have been running RPGs now for probably not as long as some of the panelists, but or at least one of them. But a good 20-something years now, and horror is, I guess, as they say, my jam. It's what I'm drawn to more than anything else. In a sense, it's my easy mode, but I love it. I love telling horror stories and participating in them as players as well.
Wonderful. And next to you, we have Newman. Welcome.
Hello. Thank you very much for having me. I am the host of the Miskatonic Playhouse, and we are massively involved in our community. It's a Call of Cthulhu community. We play, we give opportunities to interview, to have lots of people on, and we actually play community scenarios. We actually have written lots ourselves. We're a part of that community, and we've been doing quite a lot of work with Chaosium themselves, and we've in the very, very near future got Mike Mason in one of our actual plays as well, which is a nice treat for us. But we're a bit of a hub within that environment, and we're all writers, and I'm a writer myself, and I think I would echo Matthew there. Horror and mystery is very much my jam.
Cool. And next we have Jason. Hello, and welcome.
A pleasure. I'm Jason Fryer, writer, game designer, and general curmudgeon. I've probably been writing since 1995 when I started working for Cult Divinity and Cult Second Ed, as it was back then. Recently wrote the Beyond Darkness and Madness Game Master module, or book for Cult Divinity Lost. Worked in various other games, usually horror, mainly because horror has been everybody has said, my jam quite some time. After I discovered Call of Cthulhu back in 1982, I've kind of been hooked on it ever since. So I'm looking forward to talking to you and my peers.
Wonderful. And lastly, the great and honourable Scott Dorward, joining over from Good Friends. Welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you. I'm not sure I'd describe myself as either great or honourable, but I appreciate it. But yes, hi, I'm Scott. I write the occasional thing for RPGs, mainly Call of Cthulhu. I do a lot of podcasting, largely with the good friends of Jackson Elias. I do a fair bit of actual play stuff online as well, mainly with How We Roll and Ain't Slayed Nobody. And I occasionally guest on other podcasts.
Wonderful. So our topic... anything else?
Oh, sorry. And no, I was just going to say, and as you darkly hinted earlier, I have been playing horror RPGs for longer than most of the panel has been alive.
Cool. And yeah, actually, that's what I kind of wanted to start a bit the conversation to ease up on in the section about game mastering tonight. And the main question is, why did you guys choose horror RPGs? And what was the hook that kind of got you off into that genre compared to the classical approach you start with Dungeons and Dragons and fantasy role-playing games? You know, I mean, myself, I started with D&D and at some point miraculously found the idea of Call of Cthulhu, and I was like, oh, that's so much more better, or so much better, and I'm so intrigued by the system. So is there an origin story that you can relate to, and what was kind of the hook that kind of transitioned you, or that kept you within the horror genre, rather than fantasy or classical kind of D&D style systems?
Well, I'll go first. So for me, it was simply that, to begin with, I was a massive fan of horror movies and media. It grabbed me more than anything else as a teenager. Never directly transitioned into gaming, although I suppose it did in video game terms. And like many people, one of my first RPGs was D&D. It wasn't my very first, but it was one of my first. And what I found, and I enjoy Dungeons & Dragons, I enjoy fantasy roleplay, but what I found was the vast majority of people I played with, the vast majority of GMs or DMs I had for games like D&D had a certain limited approach to mood, to tone, to story. There was always the treasure hunt, the monster slaying, the dungeon crawl. Perfectly fine in their own right, but that wasn't really what appealed to me. And then I started playing games like Call of Cthulhu and Vampire the Masquerade and Cult, and gosh, well, lots of other horror games, Chill, Dead of Night, that all flesh must be eaten. And what I found through those games was a great deal more satisfaction as a storyteller, because the players paid more attention. And as a player, I found I had more agency, almost. I had more purpose. I found that my character's emotions were more, I guess, realistic, more authentic. I couldn't relate to playing a character who was quite happy to cleave through goblin after goblin after goblin, but I could relate to an investigator in Call of Cthulhu that was, as all characters are in Call of Cthulhu, afraid to open the door, because you don't know what's on the other side of it and whether it will kill you straight away. And it's a very simple appeal, but it appealed to me very quickly, and I think cemented in my mind that, okay, this is a genre that I can sort of twist and turn and manipulate and tell interesting stories in, and get the most out of my players through horror. Certainly more so than I could with, I guess, straight fantasy.
Okay. What about the others? Any specific memories or mentions that you have on that topic?
For me, yeah, it's not too dissimilar. There's a slightly different slant. I was, for my sins, once upon a time, I was an actor, and it was that realm of, when I got into tabletop role-playing games with a friend of mine who talked about it, and I said, let's do that. And he said, okay, I'm not running it, you run it. I went, okay. So it's that classic one of, you pick up and you run it because nobody else will, and then you all kind of go, actually, this is amazing. But I think, yeah, there's a lot of echoing there. There was D&D in the early days, but there was also, as soon as things like Call of Cthulhu, Vampire, Delta Green, as soon as these things were found, it was this realization that the ability to role play was just expounded upon, because the interplay you could have with your characters, the fact that you were tiny mortal little bits of flesh that could be terrified, and you had to have much more of a conversation. You couldn't just be the barbarian and go, I'll see you guys in a minute, I'm just going to go and deal with this problem, and that's it. The whole mystery thing, and I think that's it for me. There's horror, and horror is the key, but when that's intertwined with a sense of mystery and narrative, rising tension, suspense, atmosphere, all the things that we love, it's just beautiful storytelling. That shared narrative is the drug that is this game that keeps us all coming back, I think.
There's something to be said for communal suffering.
Indeed.
It's how I start every sermon.
I think that isn't that just being British.
Yes.
God knows. No. you can get more out of a gaming group, or certainly I can, by putting them through the mill a little, well, the characters through the mill, hopefully. And yeah, it's like you say, mystery and scares. It's a very instinctive, it's a very primitive way of appealing to people, but it's stories around the campfire. And the most appealing stories around the campfire are the scary ones, because they make people huddle closer and pay attention to what you're saying.
Hmm. And Jason and Scott, yeah.
For me, because I joined D&D really young back in 1979, a lot of the imagery that was actually in the books was quite horrifying. I mean, you had people being eaten and attacked. And what's more scary than being in a claustrophobic dungeon in the dark with no light, and there's something out in there hunting you? So I always approached D&D from the horror aspect. Because, I mean, it had body horror. It had, like I said, isolation. So when I finally found Call of Cthulhu, that just kind of I expounded upon that, and then eventually all the people that would play in my groups wanted more of that, because they had always been used to people that were, it's the bowling pin kind of play, where they just go into a room, knock things down, go to the next room. They wanted the visceral, emotional response, and horror just seemed to be the perfect way to give them that. I'm used to people.
Yeah, I'd agree with
bowling
what
pin
Jason
kind of
said there,
play, where they
that
just
my
go into a
first
room,
experience
knock
was
things
playing
down,
D&D,
go to
which
the
was
next
the
room.
first game I came to, made it feel much more like a horror game, because I had no idea what was going on and what all these different abilities meant and what the monsters were. We were just wandering around dark holes in the ground, and it felt like anything could kill us at any moment. And that, actually, I think, felt scarier than most horror games that I've played. But that said, I mean, I started gaming back in the early 80s, and I immediately started looking for other games after I tried D&D, just because I was interested in other genres. And I'd been a horror fan since I was a kid. It was pretty much always what I gravitated towards. And I remember reading White Dwarf magazine back in the days when it wasn't just a Games Workshop organ. I mean, it was still published by Games Workshop, but they covered things other than Warhammer. And they used to publish Call of Cthulhu scenarios. And I remember reading some of those after D&D and Traveller, and just looking at them and sort of thinking, oh, this is what I want. This is what I've been waiting for. And so ran out and bought the second edition Call of Cthulhu that Games Workshop had licensed, and pretty much spent the rest of the 80s playing that almost exclusively. And yeah, but as far as why I'm drawn to it is concerned, I mean, I don't tend to rationalize it too much. It's just, I think, certain people are drawn to certain material. You know, it's just the way our brains are wired. That some of us like the dark, we like horror, we like the iconography that goes with it. It's just, you know, it's how our brains work. And I play all sorts of other games. I like, you know, pretty well every genre that's out there. But I'll always go back to horror.
Okay. That's kind of primarily, I think, very much a common sense that I heard also from other keepers and GMs throughout what I experienced. And we got a kind of question that kind of binds or base on this. What was the best piece of off-genre media or kind of, relatable material that you used to refine your horror keeping skills from that early on, and kind of that you utilized to kind of then go deeper into the horror?
We'll keep going in this order, just to voice it out. I'm taking charge. You know, in terms of horror media, it's very easy to recommend a favorite movie or a favorite game or anything like that. But something that's really grabbed me recently, and it's helped me a great deal with things like Delta Green games, especially, is and Scott may know the name of it because the actual name is flying out my mind. It was on BBC Sounds, so BBC Radio 4 probably.
Oh, what?
There's a Call of
The
Cthulhu.
Lovecraft Investigations?
That's it, Lovecraft
Yes.
Investigations. There's about 3
yeah.
seasons of it,
Oh yeah.
I think, and there's spin-offs of it since. And they've done Whisper in the Darkness, they've done Shadow over Innsmouth, and they've given and Charles Dexter Ward, but they've given contemporary twists to them, and the sense of immersion in these audio plays is fantastic. They do the sort of BioShock audio files thing. We're going to find evidence and listen to these people who have passed away or gone missing in interviews. Willett and Ward talking about his case. You have excellent mood music. Footsteps through a damp forest, chases, all kinds of things. And because it's a full cast as well, I can listen to that kind of thing and I can think, right, well, I'm having that for my game. Or I might even snip that piece of audio out and use it as an audio file in my game, and I have. And recently that's been something of a revelation to me as an inspirational piece of horror media. The Lovecraft Investigations, absolutely wonderful pieces that I recommend any fan of horror and horror gaming listens to.
And use headphones, because
Yes.
there are some sequences that just terrified me. So.
Yeah.
Very, very well made. I agree. Anybody else?
Yeah. You can, once again, I think we're all, to a degree, we're singing from the same sheet, and in terms of contemporary releases, that has been very popular as well. I've seen it shared through a number of Discords and Facebook groups and things. It's just been so well made and so popular. BBC did a fantastic job with it. In terms of, I think the question was kind of that bit of skill, that bit of info that you kind of learned and picked up to refine your keeping or GMing. I think for me, I did mention once upon a time being an actor. Well, I can safely say that that's a very limited capacity thing now, because I'm now the other side of that. When they say you can't do, you teach. Well, that's kind of my bag. As a teacher of drama, it's next level, because I get to spend my day job kind of talking about what we're doing, but just without saying the word tabletop role-playing game. And looking at directors, looking at plays, looking at dramatic tension, looking at tension, suspense, talking about these things, looking at I have to say it, looking at students and how they naturally just do this. And, Scott was talking about a natural inclination and not having to essentially box off what that meaning is. Just seeing it in quite an honest state is incredibly powerful. And I took students to see The Woman in Black not too long ago. And the effect on me was fantastic, but talking to the students about it, these are sixth form students, these are kind of 18-year-old students and whatever, the way they talked about it was essentially, I was making mental notes going, you are telling me all the triggers here which delivered those parts of the story to you in the best possible way. And it was as much for them. I think the thing that terrified them the most, it wasn't even and I won't do any spoilers, but it wasn't the big boo scares. It's the 30 seconds before. It's holding them in that suspense in that moment, and that's the fun. Yeah, I think that for me, that really refined a lot of what I do as a keeper. Not just kind of Jason mentioned earlier about the kind of the dungeon crawl and banging around and stuff, and there's that moment, isn't there? What we can do with horror is we can play with our audience. We can negotiate that kind of non-verbal contract that we have with them and keep them where we want them for a little bit longer, just to see what happens.
Oh, absolutely. I think anticipation is key for horror, in grabbing that anticipation. The players have more in their head than you could ever give them. They will scare themselves, and you've just got to give them that little push, and they will terrify themselves. But for media recently, probably be Benson and Moorhead, directors who have done Spring, Resolution, and The Endless, and a couple of other films. They deal they deal with the existential dread and cosmic horror, but in a more modern perspective. And I just love the way that they use their cinematography and their character interactions just to build these hidden narratives, and you're filling in like again the anticipation. You're filling in the spaces. They can just give you a quick image, and you don't need to see Cthulhu, but you know that that's Cthulhu sitting out there in the dark, and you don't need to see it, but you feel it. And I think feelings are exactly what horror is. Horror is an emotion, not a genre. And as long as you can play with that, you can really make people squirm. So.
Yeah. Scott, you just ran a scenario. How was that in grabbing the players for that, and what did inspire you for this?
Oh, for that particular scenario, I have no idea. I mean, I know what inspired it was that I was asked to write a game that would run in 2 hours, and that was the original version of it. And so I thought, what's a nice simple hook that'll be easy to play in 2 hours? But I don't know where that one came from. And that's true of a lot of things. But if I'm thinking back to conscious media inspirations, I'm going back to my very early days as a GM. The biggest influence, I think, and this is going to go in the face of all the advice that everyone else has just offered, the biggest bit of inspiration I had as an early keeper was reading Clive Barker's The Books of Blood as they came out, because that was a more visceral approach to horror than most that I'd encountered until that stage. But at the same time, it wasn't just the kind of Guy N. Smith, Sean Hudson approach to gore. It was intelligent, and it was literate, and it had emotional depth. And it was really fucking weird too, like really weird. There's some amazing ideas all the way through. But the thing that stuck with me was how skillfully Barker describes the more visceral side of horror, the blood, the guts, the gore, the physical transformations, all the things that make us uncomfortable on a gut level. And I generally, when I'm running horror games, aim for that side of horror. I find it very difficult to sustain terror, the higher form of fear, in an RPG, because I think most players aren't geared up for that. That, on the whole, people, I think, approach RPGs in a different way than they might approach watching a horror film, for example. That people say they want to be scared in an RPG, but in practice, they'll be making jokes and distracting themselves all the way through, and it's difficult to sustain that atmosphere. But if you can go for the guts, yeah, I mean that's going to stick with them. And so, yeah, I'm not afraid to go
low. Which actually brings me to another question that was submitted, which is exactly based on that player engagement that you kind of just now flushed out a bit. Especially doing online conventions, it's one of the people who submitted questions was saying. He often finds that creating the atmosphere for players who look like a blank screen because there's no camera can sometimes make it difficult for him to kind of run the scene. And especially if you don't utilize kind of camera and just run by audio only, it creates this awkwardness, especially if you have like technical difficulties or you're just starting to describe a scene that kind of, create these awkwardness. Do you guys have any tips for GMs who run audio only, and how can you kind of maintain the player engagement when you don't really see the reaction of the players? Because I think that's, for me as well, I rely upon seeing the players kind of like shifting uncomfortably in their seats, giving that moment of pause before I continue the explanation. And I feel like that's a very powerful tool to see the other person's reaction. But if you don't have that, how do you try to navigate your gaming?
That's a really good question, because the answer, I think, is different when doing a one-shot for a convention when compared to running a campaign. You have a lot more leeway when running for a long-term group. And I mean, I run for something like 6 or 7 different gaming groups a month for my Patreon supporters, and so they're all playing different games, they're all different groups, and they're all audio only. We don't do cameras for any of it. And the way I manage it, Wraith the Oblivion is a really good example. That's one of the games I'm running. Is if we have long-form roleplay with one particular character, you start bringing in other players as NPCs. I know not everyone is very fond of that, but Wraith is a very good example of a game where you can send a character into a harrowing, which is a form of twisted flashback. And because it's not real history, because it's something that's there to essentially traumatize the character and see whether they can be dragged into oblivion, you can have the other players start getting involved as sort of abstract versions of their characters or warped versions of their characters. That's a good way of keeping people involved at an active level. But for one-shots and campaigns, I think that one of the best ways to keep people engaged is to do solo roleplay. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but essentially, if everyone is experiencing an insight, like a sneak peek into a character's personal life, or experiences that the other characters don't get an opportunity to access, they will be more interested to find out what happens next in that character's, next solo roleplay, or what have you. Obviously, in one-shots, that's slightly more difficult. You can't just take every player away for 20 minutes and tell everyone else to wait. But you can do 5-minute snapshots. They can be in medias res. They can be just brief blinks into the past. And for me, I find that works really well. Again, it sounds counterintuitive to make other players play the audience. But I think if you set it up as everyone is going to get one of these, and these things may come up later as hooks, it drives engagement from the audience. So yeah, that's my tip, I guess.
It's a good question. It's a very good question. I think in my experience, the ways I've done it, and I completely agree. Seeing your players, for me, I really thrive on that, in the sense that I'm seeing the other people and seeing their reactions, being able to converse with them in that way. But I am a player in a game where it's just audio, and I love it. And I have run games where it has just been audio in conventions as well, and I kind of like it. It kind of adds a different atmosphere. I find that I'm still massively role playing even when I can't see anybody, and I am very active in my role play towards the group. But and again, this is a technology based thing and people's comfort with technology. But if I'm running a game, and I'm running a game tomorrow for the con, I'll definitely be utilizing some music and sound effects, only to the ability that I've got. I am not a DJ, mix master, anything like that, but I do know where the play button is, and I do have a little playlist in the software that we'll be using. So I think if I haven't got this visual contact, I do think that that's quite good, especially if it's a convention game. It's not been recorded for an actual play where those things would be added in post. It's something I can play with in the moment, and I can play with the levels and things. The only other, I suppose, aspect that I would try and use, and I will be using for my players tomorrow, is especially in a convention game when there's lots going on, it's a short time, and you want to tell a really good story and keep, as you say, as Matthew's saying, keep the individual players engaged even when they have their own moment or a group moment. Is I'll digitally kind of have that dashboard, and it's not used like this, but kind of use it as a bit of a murder board. So when handouts come out, I kind of place them there and build them up. So you're building a picture for those players. So wherever they're looking, if they are seeing this growing sense of handouts, and I know that might relate to any certain scenarios and certain games, but in Call of Cthulhu, we know that those handouts are a huge part of the mystery and the fun of what that is. I think that's a really powerful thing, is having those visual there. They're almost kind of piling up. You're building the mystery before them, literally. And I don't know, is that a bit of a taunt to your players that you're kind of putting all the clues there and going, have you worked it out yet? I don't know, but those would be some of the tricks I would use.
I would one of the tricks that I would have to use is inflection in voice. Just basically, you're trying to draw them in. Recently, I did a couple of cons running Bluebeard's Bride, and it's a very, very personal horror game. But one player is always kind of the lead, and the others are always listening because they're playing different sisters, and only one can be in charge at a time. They're the same person, different aspects of that person's personality. And I was always trying to make sure that I would include hints to the other players within the dialogue to the one I was speaking to, and that way everybody was listening at the exact same time. So the more you can include them, and yes, just draw them into the narrative, the more engaged they'll become. And it's very difficult in Bluebeard's Bride because one of the aspects, or one of the moves, is making the person shiver. If the player shivers, they actually take psychological damage to their character. That's a little hard when you can't actually see the person. So you have to be very careful and listen to the various voices, because voices can really give away fear. You know, like a quick gasp, quick shudder, you can actually hear it. So you have to be very attentive. That's all I can say.
Yeah, I'll echo what Jason said there, that if your only tool is your voice in running a game, then you obviously have to use that voice well. Beyond that, I personally struggle an awful lot playing with people I can't see. I rely an awful lot on being able to read people's expressions and reactions, and without that, yeah, it's certainly taking away one of my main tools as a GM. And I find it even harder as a player because I rely very much on being able to see people for engagement there, just simply because I have aphantasia. I don't have a mind's eye, so I don't visualize anything when I'm gaming. I rely entirely on words and seeing the people around me. And without seeing the people as well, that's like a further barrier to engagement, and I find it very easy just to drift off and switch off at that stage. So I generally try to avoid games where there's no visual component.
Okay. I actually want to kind of pick up on several of those points, great points, which is kind of maintaining the player engagement. Also, leads often maybe to, as Newman said, kind of you give them all the clues and they kind of, let's figure it out. You keep them engaged and they have something to do. But at some point, I think in the Keeper's Handbook tip, it's referred to as the pineapple on the shelf. Like the moment when you give too many clues or too suspicious clues where you're trying to give maybe not really intentionally a red herring, but you create a scene where you mention something subconsciously or not really conscious, and the players just go after it. How do you kind of break them off from there again? Like without kind of derailing, like, oh, it wasn't really important, but then why did you mention it? So my players usually, well, you mention it, so even if you say now that it wasn't important, I will go after it because like that makes more sense to me now. So what is a good way to kind of give players the agency in order to investigate yet find out nothing, but then come to the conclusion that, yeah, I just fucked up?
Well, there's certain steps you can take to ensure that doesn't happen. Namely, there should never be a vital clue that's hidden behind a pass-fail die roll. But if let's say that happens, and it does, of course, plenty of times the players will they will work out that this person must be the killer, and therefore this is the person we need to drag out before the magistrate or what have you. Then I mean, it may be a bit of a cop out, but this is where the skill of improv helps a GM or keeper make that person the killer, or allow them to pass all the way down that, utterly convinced, and have all the other NPCs convinced that they are right, and that person gets strung up from the gallows, case closed, but then the killings continue. Because then that's automatic sequel bait. What if we were wrong? And they can start doubting themselves. I think the worst thing you can do is to try and quite deliberately steer them. Now, that's not always the case. Sometimes some groups are going to respond very well to a GM saying, I think you're barking up the wrong tree there. But you can do that through an NPC. You don't have to do it out of character, and break any sense of immersion, because that's just going to frustrate most players. They'll think, well, why not just tell us the answer? It's where some games have merits like common sense, so they can ask the GM a question. Well, if they take that, if that's the way they want to play, that's absolutely fine. But I find most want the game to tell them what to do, which means if they make a mistake, and if they are committed to that mistake, you either decide it isn't a mistake and reward them for their skillful deduction, or you work that mistake into the plot.
I am hands up guilty of exactly what you've just said there. I'm very lucky on the Miskatonic Playhouse at the minute. I'm running the first kind of long form production that we've done, Cult and Culpability, which is with the Regency. Yeah, and we're loving it. We're having so much fun doing it. I won't say anything because I know some of them are going to be listening, and I'm not. Yeah, just obviously just being careful with some things there. But I can tell you now, from early doors, there are two rather major, significant kind of plot points that have now just become a feature. And it's exactly what you said. It was a case of failing forwards, but also rewarding the investigators for finding things and really chasing it and proving that there was something going on here. And rather than, sidestepping your own game, destroying everybody's illusion, the investment that they've made in this kind of line of inquiry, it made sense to pull them into the narrative. So there wasn't any kind of railroading. It was more essentially the bumper lanes at bowling, where you just kind of go, yeah, okay, that's great. And now that thing that you've done it's going to pull back into here, but we're actually going to take this thing that you've worked out, this narrative that you've helped co-created, that's now a part of the story. And it's been really good, actually, because I've taken those things and those kind of began to run with them, and I think that's really rewarded the investigators. In hindsight, if I was to analyze that, I think taking the line of inquiry that wasn't quite right, but they jumped on it and they were certain of it, they've been rewarded. It's opened up a whole extra line of narrative for me, and it's enthused and pulled those investigators back into this main kind of investigative state. So I would say that kind of, as Matthew's saying there, that kind of, you're kind of rewarding them for finding it and you're pulling them in. I could have had an NPC that just kind of went, you're barking up the wrong tree. I feel like it would have been a bit of a roadblock, perhaps, to the characters, but also to the players and their investment and their enjoyment. Obviously, you can't always do that, and I was in a lucky position. But I would echo that. I think that's been a really good lesson that I've kind of learned on the ground with that one as well.
If I can add one more thing on this, because again, I think it's a really interesting topic, and it's come up for me not long ago when I was running horror on the Orient Express for something like the 9th time. And like any published adventure, and certainly in the case of Orient Express, it is railroaded by design. It's linear. It's very linear, to the point that if you screw up, if you miss something, if you kill the wrong NPC, you will basically be cutting your hand off, almost literally, in that game. And this happened to my group in Paris very early on. You're supposed to encounter the Jigsaw Prince, and their first encounter with the Jigsaw Prince, they blew his head off with a shotgun. They just blew his head off. They rolled very well. opened its head like a cantaloupe. Despite all the Dreamlands ickiness that was going on, they managed it, and I wasn't going to take that away from them by having him immediately resurrect, though that might have been scary. I wanted them to feel rewarded for rolling well, because how often does that actually happen? How often do you get to kill the boss in one hit, or the sub-boss, I guess? And so I just had to start engineering the rest of the story around what was going to happen. Who was I going to have to replace the Jigsaw Prince's role in the game? And so I had to use Fenalik in different ways at that point, and I had to use the cultists in Milan in different ways at that point. I had to start pulling interesting characters who could then reappear later, but it is all on the GM. And the great thing about these published linear adventures is they have so many interesting NPCs that you can expand. You don't have to run it straight from the book, because as soon as the characters veer off, you will be paralyzed and you will be able to do nothing. You use the resources and you expand them with your imagination, and it tends to work.
Yeah.
Yeah, from a very early age, I learned play to find out, even before that became an expression. And the culminating moment was Call of Cthulhu, old published module, can't remember the name, but basically it was an old haunted house. Beneath it is a whole bunch of deep ones, and they've taken over the family, blah, blah, blah. There's one small description in one of the rooms that says, a malformed deer head. For whatever reason, my players completely fixated on this. It is just a throwaway statement. To the point that they were tearing apart a chimney, they were tearing down the walls, trying to figure out what had to do with this deer head. So I just tossed the rest of the module and just leaned into a Wendigo. And this was just one of the actual family members being mounted on the wall. So as long as you can improv, don't feel constrained by the guidelines of a linear module. They've given you the resources, use them, tweak them, make them your own, and make it your groups. So in some cases, if they're barking up the wrong tree, yeah, maybe they're just following the wrong thread, and it's just going to tear apart everything. But for the most part, just let them help you tell the story.
Yeah, I agree 100% with Jason there. That's very much my experience of GMing as well. It's rare for me to run something that's published. I tend to either just make stuff up as I go along or run stuff that I've written. And when I run stuff that I've written, it very rarely comes across the way that it is on the page, because I will be constantly changing and adapting it according to what the players are doing. And I think there are a couple of ways of looking at games that I've learned over the years, usually from other sources, that have really helped cement that. One is a trick I picked up from my friend Malcolm Craig years back, the author of A Station, Hot War, and Cold City, who talked about horror game. Talked about RPG scenarios being situations rather than scenarios. So the idea is that you as a scenario writer / GM, it's your job to create problems for the players, and it's the players' job to come up with solutions to that. And as soon as you start thinking about, and of course this is what the players are going to do, then that's going to fall apart badly, because people will never do what you expect them to do. And so that is just a path to failure. And the other was, I realized some time back that I didn't particularly enjoy writing or running investigative games. But when I do, I tend to think of them in terms of, rather than a series of clues, bits of information that I'm trying to get into the hands of the player characters and the players, so that they can make informed decisions and do interesting things based on that. And so rather than thinking of clues in the game, I'll be thinking about what information I want to deliver. And so if they go off and talk to a completely unexpected NPC or go somewhere I wasn't expecting, then that is just an opportunity for me to improvise and use that as a mechanism for getting the information to them that I perhaps assumed they were going to get from the library or something like that. Well, in the end, it doesn't matter that they went to the library instead of the morgue if they get a bit of information that they can then do something useful with. And so I think that flexibility and willingness and ability to improvise is essential to running a dynamic game.
Yeah, narratives is a tapestry. You can pull as many threads as you want and follow as many threads as you want. You'll eventually get to the end of it. Just let them pull whatever thread that they want.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, also with what Scott said, I tend to read through the script or the prepared scenario, but then while playing, I add scenes where I'm like, oh, this is a perfect time to kind of just make a hook, or like maybe you're just about to take a break, so I'm creating a bit strange things about this or adding something to it, but letting it run through, and they can keep that clue with them or that information rather than the clue. The freedom to kind of change scenarios, I think, is what I realized after running a couple of scenarios like as written pretty soon, that it works to an extent if you try to follow up a scenario as written. But at some point, your players will go completely the other side. They will follow that deformed elk on the mantelpiece or whatever. And you want to kind of continue the narrative. And therefore, you want to kind of have a fun evening, right? That's the ultimate kind of aim of the game, I feel like. And so kind of going forward. But then again, what I kind of want to lead to is the question, how do you ensure still a timely conclusion of your game when, for example, you have a fixed time frame of a con game and after 4 hours the game is over, or ideally after that players have different things to do after that? How do you maintain kind of pacing versus also kind of maintaining the narrative to bring it to a conclusion? So if they missed a couple clue, do you just dump everything on them and say like, okay, here, figure it out, or do a learning roll in a sense, or library use or intelligence roll, depending on the game system, to help them kind of like quickly figure this out? Or do you accept that maybe they didn't figure it out and the unknowing is the result of the game?
Well, I'm absolutely terrible at timing games and making sure they end on time. If I was a showrunner, I would probably be in charge of The Walking Dead or Supernatural, and we'd still be going, and those zombies still wouldn't have fucking decomposed. Inexplicably. In terms of the best rule I have for horror, which I tend to set for Cthulhu, for They Came From Beyond the Grave, and They Came From Camp Murder Lake especially, is characters will not meet a lethal end until we hit the halfway mark. So you can do stupid things if you want. You can endanger yourself, you can injure yourself, you can risk other characters' health if you want up to the halfway mark. But essentially, Jason Voorhees is going to appear on the scene at that midway point, at which point all bets are off. Now that creates a sense of urgency for the players, because you will signal when that halfway mark appears, though it might come after a break, for instance. But it also allows you, as the GM, a certain amount of freedom to start. Although killing characters is, of course, a very final decision to make, but you can start hounding them, you can start clamping down on them. And I find that then it's more of a sprint to the end than a sluggish crawl. In general, when I'm running one-shots for conventions, I try and make the plot something with a sense of urgency. It isn't just, a sort of Jonathan Creek mystery room. But those do work too, but they don't tend to be my games. I tend to go for something where danger is imminent, it's oppressive, now it's on you, or something similar. And that sort of forces the end. I don't think I've ever come up against a situation where we've got to the end and the mystery isn't solved in some form, though I guess if I did, I think I would probably... I think I probably would just have to call it and say, and basically have the slow autopsy of the game and say, well, what did we learn? Which doesn't sound very satisfactory, but sometimes it is. I've played in games like that where the players are really interested to know, what didn't we get? What didn't we understand? There's all this moments, and of course, why didn't we speak to that weirdo rocking on the veranda? That kind of
Right.
so it can work, but yeah, I think urgency is the solution to that problem.
Yeah, I mean, I'm running Be My Valentine tomorrow, and I am the author of the scenario, so that kind of helps in terms of burning up on the actual story. That does help, but I know that I write in a way that I tell stories as well. I tend to do a bit of a 3-act structure. I think with a convention game, it kind of helps me to know in terms of timing. Act 1 should definitely be finishing by now if I haven't already kind of done this kind of stuff. So a little bit linking into what we were talking about before, that doesn't have. It's not a finite thing. It's not a rule set to follow. It's more of a feeling. It's instinctual. It's a player. Yeah, we talked about this shared narrative, but there could be, as Matthew mentioned, it could be a NPC that delivers anything significant. It's if there's things that the investigators need to know, like you said, it shouldn't be down to a dice roll. If they need to know it for the narrative and the enjoyment of the game, that they're going to get that. There might be a lot of things, some things that are uncovered, extra things, little tidbits of information, but I will try to follow that. I'm saying that like as if I will follow my own rules. I'd like to think that that's the way I will do it and have done it before, but I think we all know we see the last 15-20 minutes of the clock come up, don't we, and we all go, okay, what's the and I can say this for certainty that David actually I was in a game that David ran a long time ago, and I still remember it to this day as one of the best games that I'd played in. And David was gracious enough at the end of said game, because the 3 investigators, I won't go into too much detail, but I believe we got so close to making it and solving the whole thing. We didn't. We all died horribly. In fact, if I remember correctly, my character turned and killed the other characters, is what I remember from that.
That was maybe the case.
Yeah, David was brilliant in that. At the end of the game, we had a brilliant kind of round the table chat and talked about some of the things that we could have done, couldn't have done. I know you can't really do that with a convention game because of the time limit, but it was really nice actually, because it made you go, oh bugger, of course, that thing with the stuff that we should have done this. But it was almost quite nice going, we missed it and we played our version. We played our game. I think that was the nice thing we kind of took away from that experience.
Yeah.
For me, I've always kind of drifted away from the Western concept of conclusion and gone over more towards a resolution. And what do I mean by that? A conclusion is more, everything has to be tied up. If you look at what Hollywood movies and such, everything needs to be tied up in a tight bow. Usually in a game, that's never going to happen. And if you try to push towards that, you're actually going to warp the narrative in many ways. But with a resolution, something that makes sense narratively, for the characters, for the story itself, if you can push towards that, it gets a little easier to gauge your time. When I was running Narrative Space recently, which was a Cult Divinity Lost actual play, I would always watch the time and try to weave in the narrative beats that would create a more pleasant or unpleasant resolution, so that when we actually wrap up, there'd still be questions left, but everybody would feel satisfied with what had happened and the point that they were leaving the story at. Because I've always wanted to, in many ways, you wanted them to want more, not just everything's solved, everything's happy. I mean, especially with resolution, yes, you can wipe out your entire party and make them feel good about it, because that's what makes sense.
Yep.
Yeah. I agree with that 100%. Having a strong emotional point on which to end, something cathartic, is for me far more important than tying up loose ends. And I'll go for that every time in a convention game. The other tricks that I use, I mean, again, it's going back to the idea of not really thinking of them as investigative. Um, when I run convention games, generally, I mean, this isn't universal, but generally I think of them in terms of here's a group of characters, here's a bad situation that they find themselves in. What are they going to do about it? Let's play to find out where this ends up. And there's a tool that I borrowed from Ron Edwards's game Sorcerer, which is bangs. So bangs are just decision points that you throw at the players to keep the pace up. So the idea of a good bang is you're presenting the player characters with a problem that there isn't a prescribed solution to. It's something that they are going to have to make a decision about, a problem that they're going to have to overcome. And if you use an escalating series of bangs throughout the game that present more and more danger or push things towards some kind of emotional crisis or existential crisis, then you use that and then you have some kind of cathartic resolution. Then you have a great deal of control over the pace and timing of it. Because at no point are you thinking, well, they haven't even discovered what's buried under the vicarage yet, so how are we ever going to find out where this is going? Because in the end, that may not be important to where their characters are going to end up.
100%, I think. Actually, I think it was mentioned in between, but I think was something that I heard from a couple other GMs as well, is especially during maybe also convention games, or if you have paid games in a sense where you donate, or like we did, how do you deal with a PC death about a third halfway in, and well, yeah, he's dead. How do you recover that player? Do you just let him stand on the side? Is there a way to just because like sometimes it's hard to just like, remember that one NPC that you talked 5 minutes ago? Yeah, you're now playing him. I have no stats for him, but make them up or something. What's your suggestion of recovery of an uncertain player death? Because it might have been unlucky, or it shouldn't rely upon that one climb roll and he falls to his death because he breaks his neck or something. But if he does something stupid, or if the players do something unexpected and it turns out to be really, really bad, what do you do?
Well, I don't know if this is a cop-out answer or not. I don't think I would go into a game where death is a possibility halfway in or a third of the way in without telling the players in advance that this could happen, basically getting their buy-in. And if it is, I can then have the conversation with them. Okay, well, if your character dies, do you want to stay around as a spectator, or do you want to pick another character up for that part? Or, depending on the game, do you want your character to come back as a ghost or a zombie or a vampire or whatever? So the situation, I know it's ideal world, because as you say, there are situations where it should occur, but the situation shouldn't occur. The GM does have complete control. They have complete fiat over whether these rocks fall and kill, whether this laser annihilates, whether that wound that should have ripped you in half does in fact only rip your leg off. That's still grievous. It will still probably kill you by the end of the session, but you can still be an active injured part if injury is the way forward. I mean, there's lots of ways to do it that don't completely freeze a player out. Yeah, dismemberment, imprisonment, capture. Still give them the opportunity to roleplay. Still give them the opportunity to fight back. But if they do something stupid, if they run face first at the serpent people with their death rays on sticks, and they're not thinking, you then have the decision. Did you forewarn them death could happen? Yes? Well, this is death. No? Okay, the serpent people set their phases to stun instead. It's perhaps cheap, but I do think, as you say, if someone's paying for a slot, they should enjoy themselves. But if they're paying for a slot and they've been told this is a game where death can occur, as harsh as it might sound, they shouldn't feel too surprised if their characters die.
Yeah, I think putting those that cage around it in terms of if someone's paying for a game and we're talking about this a role playing experience, that shared narrative storytelling, it would be I would be gutted if I'd kind of say, oh god, yeah, I've done this, I'm in the lottery and I'm going to be in this game, this is going to be great, and 10 minutes in I make a silly decision because I thought it was a really clever thing but clearly it wasn't, and I'm dead, and then the keeper just says, yeah, you can keep watching the game if you like, or just sign off. I'd be absolutely gutted, because you want to role play. It's what it's Scott's talking about this cathartic experience, and that's 100% exactly what this is. It's why people do this, because you get to play these wonderful characters in these very wildly horrific situations, and you get to share an emotional state. You get to have that experience of you don't get that experience if you're dead. So I think what Matthew's saying there about, I like that. I've never thought of it in that way, but I like that the halfway mark. You do silly things up to the halfway mark and you'll get some serious in-game warnings, whether that's through actions and consequences or via an NPC or even your fellow investigators, who I'm sure would say, don't do that, that's a really silly thing to do in character. Or not. Maybe they're running with them towards the snake people. But
I think that's a really good point to mention, the fact that if you are being stupid in character in a way that isn't necessarily harming the rest of the players, then fill your boots. But if you're doing it in a way that's disrupting play, that's a very different kind of stupidity. And I probably wouldn't even lead to the satisfaction of killing the character, because if a player's being disruptive, for me, game stop, speak to the player, say, okay, you need to stop being disruptive.
Right.
For their enjoyment as well as everybody else's.
Yeah, it doesn't matter if you've paid, if you're being an asshole.
Yeah, and other people are paying as well, so
exactly.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that's a very rare thing.
Yes,
exactly.
Quite right. I think the final thing on that is exactly what you've kind of said, and I think you mentioned it earlier as well. I can't remember which one of you, and I am making notes on you guys, so I can say you wise fellows. I've made some serious notes on conclusion, resolution, bangs. It's all going down here in my book. But I really like the idea, that kind of halfway mark, and as long as there's been, it's like anything, isn't it? It's like the X card, it's like lines and boundaries. As long as things have been discussed, if there's a conversation saying, towards the end in Act 3 or wherever we get to, there is a real sense that your character could die, but as Scott was saying, if there is a cathartic, emotional, rewarding experience to that, absolutely brilliant. Really, really great storytelling, shared storytelling. 100%.
Absolutely. I always try to avoid one step is to avoid the binary roles. You live, you die. You're climbing up a cliff. Just because of a bad roll, my character is now dead. I'd always try to avoid that. There's always some other effect or some other resolution that can be had. And to be trite, Cult. Since I play and write for Cult, a death is only the beginning. if you're halfway through and you're playing a game like Cult or Wraith or other horror games, death is not the end. You can become a ghost. You can be bound to something. As long as the player can contribute to the group in some way, they're still involved. They're still invested. They know that they're dead. But it's almost a more emotional effect for them, because are they still going to help? Are they going to try to hinder? Bluebeard's Bride is like that. One of the characters can shatter halfway through. They start helping the GM, making their sisters' lives miserable. They're still contributing, but it's just a different role. So just be creative, improvise, and don't focus on the binary, you're alive or you're dead, because it robs people of their agency.
I agree. Yeah, strong points there. And
Yeah.
Go.
Oh, I was going to agree with those, with not having binary roles like that. And I think a failed role is always an invitation to increase peril rather than punish the player. And I think in a horror game, that feeling of escalation, that feeling of being in more and more peril, things getting worse, is fantastic, and those failed roles are a vital part to heading in that direction. And as a general point, I think in a lot of horror games, it's far more important to present the threat of death, that that situations should feel dangerous, situations should feel uncertain. It should always feel like something terrible is about to happen if things go wrong. But death is usually the least interesting possible outcome when that happens. And so finding ways of saying that, yes, all right, you failed that climb roll, but now you're stuck on a cliff, you're hanging on by your fingertips, and the only way you can see out of it now is that tiny little crevice a few feet over that you might be able to get to, but you can hear something moving in there. And that is far worse than saying, "Oh yeah, splat."
Yeah,
I totally agree. I did want to ask something on also like the timekeeping part. Another kind of question that came in was: are you implementing any sort of tools like timeline trackers, or what is your preparation for the game to kind of run it smoother for you? How do you how much do you prepare as a GM that allows you to kind of have a timeline? When should what happen? Do you have trackers, or is it mostly like you go after how the players kind of investigate or continue the story or create the story in that case?
Oh, well, I set mine up. Most of my games, when I prepare them, are lists. I just make a list, generally bullet point some names, locations, events that must occur, and then I let the players play around within that very loose framework. But to pace it, to time it, I will tend to, I guess, set it out like a daily calendar. I will say, well, these three things have got to happen. Then at this break point, this is where the ante will up, and then these three things must happen before this occurs, and then you've got the last phase of the game. And I mean, I know it's a board game, but the Doom clock in Arkham Horror and Cthulhu Wars, its version, and the various other Lovecraftian games, always having a countdown to oblivion. is also a very nice way of doing it if you want to start the game with a very clear apocalyptic scenario approaching. Actually having a countdown in front of you not only allows you as the GM to pace the game, but it also ups the tension for the players who can actually see time ebbing away in front of them. Sometimes that's definitely better to evoke a mood than you just checking your phone occasionally to see how many hours you've got left. But yeah, I think that the Doom clock mechanic, simple as it is such a brilliant visual representation. Another one, which is less time-based but works to a similar effect. I played a Chronicles of Darkness zombie game at a convention on the South Coast back when we used to have them near Bournemouth or Christchurch, and
Oh, yes.
those heady days of IndieCon.
Oh, and Conception, yeah.
Yes, and we were playing this game, and one of the big issues in a lot of zombie games is, well, they're slow moving. Anyone can take them out with a half decent roll, but the storyteller gave us all spent shell casings to represent our bullets. That he just picked them up at an army surplus store. And so we had these nice visual, kinesthetic representations of how many bullets we had left, and we all had a very short supply. Now, if we found any during the course of gameplay, we might be able to top them up. But it immediately placed a sense of urgency on the actions we could take. Was it worth spending a bullet to get out of this situation? Was there a different way of getting out of the situation? Just a wonderful way of speeding things up, because also when those bullets do run out or get very close to running out, you also know you're getting near to the end of the session. So it's a different way of doing it that isn't specifically time as much as pace, I suppose.
Oh, that's really cool. I love that. I think that visual, visceral thing is absolutely superb. What a really, ingenious idea. I have a bit of an answer, but I'm afraid it's a little bit tied into a specific idea. I suppose just going off that idea of the doom clock and things, I quite like. So I really like what Matthew was talking about in the daily calendar. You know, you've got these kind of events, you kind of know when they're going to happen, but obviously you are being responsive to your players and their experience and, you know, how they are navigating it. But you know, that there's certain things that have to happen, and obviously you've got your lists that are going to help you navigate that. But in terms of keeping my players aware as well, I played in a Vampire the Masquerade game recently. It was brilliant because it was 20th edition as well. I love V5, but it was quite nice going back and kind of doing something with getting the old book out kind of thing. And we kind of did this thing where there was a sense of impending doom, but what that meant is that all the characters, we actually had this, which would translate to Cthulhu brilliantly. We had this kind of collective feeling, almost a feeling of dread, and it was described to us as growing. It was something that we could feel. It was quite, role play visceral, to us, and it was something that we all felt. And because it was this growing feeling that was kind of described, and we were allowed to respond and react to it, and we knew it was getting bigger, we knew it was getting worse. It really involved us in the sense of time disappearing and dwindling, and the fact that we had to try and find some kind of resolution or conflict within what we were doing. And I think in Call of Cthulhu, with the fantastic power roll, there is a very nice way to involve that in the sense of even just growing existential dread. It might not have to be tied to a spell or a monster or a creature or anything. It could just be a growing sense of impending doom, that the players just have this growing sense of, we know our time is nearly up, and by you tracking the time, you're helping the players track the time, which might help that narrative flow a bit easier. And as Matthew's talking about pace there, and really building the pace to a point where, stealing Jason's, you're gonna find your resolution, or you're gonna find your conclusion.
I like to build for preparing a narrative foundation, basically what's come before the world that the characters are walking into, because it's existed before them and will exist after. then I just do very small milestones, major narrative beats that will happen no matter what, or will be affected by the player's actions. And then play to find out. Just throw them into the mix, and as they explore, they might run into the milestones, or the milestones might give them some kind of narrative trigger. For example, if there's a spell being created, they don't have any idea about it, but its effects might drift into the story itself. You know, the weather might change, NPCs might change. But I do like that idea of physical representation of changing events. There's an old Vampire the Masquerade module that I stole horribly from. I took a chess set, placed it in the middle of the room, and whenever a narrative beat would change, I'd either move a piece or remove a piece from the board, from either side. And that freaked the players out more than anything that was happening to them, because they were just focused on the changing board, because they could sense that there's something beyond us, beyond our perceptions right now, that's going on, and it's going to kick us in the butt eventually.
Yeah, I've used a similar kind of visual cue when running Dead of Night. So Dead of Night has got this mechanic called tension, which is basically a measure of how much shit the player characters are in and how much license the GM has to screw them over. And it's a value that increases over time based on the way dice rolls go and the way other resources move around. And so basically I got this D20 that's about the size of my fist, black D20, and I'd keep it in the center of the table, and it's tension is a level that goes between 1 and 15. And so every time tension would increase, I'd just sort of theatrically reach over to the center of the table, pick up the D20, find the new value, and then hit it down hard in the center of the table with a bang. Just, yeah, okay, things have got worse for you. Right, things have got worse for you again. And yeah, that's a good attention getter. But in general terms of pacing, I'm not particularly bothered about the flow of time in the game. I'm always interested in the narrative beats, and yeah, I'm looking at bringing things into play to accelerate stuff and make stuff feel worse when it feels dramatically appropriate or emotionally appropriate to do so. In most games, if you were to ask me what time of day it is in the game, or even, you know, if it's an ongoing campaign, what month it's happening in, I wouldn't have a fucking clue. I don't care. What I care about is how bad things feel for the player characters at that stage. And I want that escalation to ramp up. And so, yeah, that's just the way I think of it.
Right, that is one of my bugbears, Scott. That I have players almost every month in a different game saying, "What time of year is this again?" I think, shit. What time of year is it supposed to be?
What did I say last time?
Yeah.
I'm running at least half a dozen games. I just need to set them all in on January the 1st, I think.
It's fall springish. Yeah.
What's the temperature?
Yeah, nebulous time. The sky is
Ambient.
great.
Fantastic. Another thing that I might want to bring in here is maybe a fear of some GMs or also new keepers, especially when it comes to modern day scenarios concerning horror, and maybe partially investigatory, but the use of technology. I mean, it's been covered in various aspects, but utilizing technology in a sense for the keeper and for the players in a way that it doesn't destroy this nice environment that you created. So what is a good way, or a couple of examples that you can suggest how to utilize technology for the players that they have on them in a rewarding, horrifying way?
I'll do a very brief one this time for a change. And it's just an example of something in a Delta Green game I'm running right now. One of the characters reached out to one of his bonds on his character sheet, his son, because he hadn't spoken to him in some time, and just because he wanted to hear his voice, everything had been going horribly wrong. And so he calls him from his Holiday Inn hotel room, say, "Are you still okay?" "Yeah, of course I am, Dad. Why are you calling me at 3 a.m.? "Oh, no reason. I just wanted to hear your voice." "Yeah, leave me alone. We'll speak tomorrow." "Okay, son. Love you." Son hangs up, because that's how these calls go. And then the father starts hearing another voice on the phone. He's sure the call disconnected, and it's just a voice saying, "You don't want to speak to your son again, Mr. whatever the agent's name is." "I'm sorry, who is this?" And at which point, and the person is just repeats these very low-level threats, just constantly threatening. "Make sure you don't involve your family in this anymore, Mr. etc." Is this Delta Green? Is this a cultist? Is this something else? At that point, because the phone never rang, the call definitely disconnected. How is there a voice coming out of this? It's just a simple twist of technology, and immediately everyone was terrified of using their phones, because it always used to be mobile phones kill horror because you can call emergency services at any time, and that's so easy to get rid of. You can easily kill that. And yeah, but I found that just a very simple thing. Did it a few days ago. They never want to touch mobile phones again.
In terms of the use of technology in the game, in the narrative, I was very lucky. We've got it coming out next year, which really isn't that far away now, is it? At the Playhouse, we were very lucky enough to have Alex Culottes and Bud of Bud's RPGs viral. We ran viral, and a big part of that game is, I think I've got it here actually somewhere. A big part of that game is that they wanted to look at exactly what Matthew's just saying, is how technology can be used in a tabletop role-playing game for narrative purposes, not for and it was, I don't want to do any spoilers because it really is a fantastic game, but you're playing a group of young ghost hunters who are going out to this abandoned hospital on this little island, and they're basically a bunch of YouTubers. So the technology is inherent to their part of the story, to the investigator's story, and it was quite wonderful, because what made it wonderful wasn't just the investigators going, "We're YouTubers, here we are doing this," and everybody kind of had their job. What made it really wonderful was that the keeper got to interact with that, because, like we're on YouTube now, in the game, the keeper got to play the part of people on YouTube saying, "Hey, can you do this and can you do that? And we're nearly at 1 million, we're nearly at 1 million views. Do this and we'll all donate whatever." And it was the keeper became basically the YouTube audience, which was interactive with the investigators in the investigation. And it was technology was the device that did that, and it was brilliant. And I know that Bud and Alex, they actively wrote something with that in mind, with technology at the forefront of a mystery. Superb, absolutely bloody fantastic storytelling, which was done, obviously via the keeper, but it was inherent within the scenario.
Yep.
Narratively, I always try to go. I lean very heavily towards the Japanese perception of horror, where the supernatural invades technology. If you look at J-horror, almost everything, there's something, another force, invading our physical world through technology, televisions, VCRs, phones. So I like to lean into that. In the moment that you make technology which is considered safe, unsafe, the players will stop using it on a regular basis. For actual technology that we have for a GM, one of the tricks I'll constantly use, especially in something like a Zoom bit, is I will do private chats to the players while the game is going on, and how their character is actually perceiving what's going on during the scene, and the effect it can have on a really good player is amazing. I can actually see the blood drain from their face. So yeah, rather than passing notes, like in the old pen and paper, you can now use various aspects of the technology to enhance your game. So use it.
Yeah, again, I agree with Jason. I mean, the J-horror boom of the early 2000s was all about technology, but horror has embraced new technology for as long as it's been a recognizable genre. And I think that's always been an essential part. Every time some new bits of technology comes along, some horror writer looks at that and thinks, "Oh, how can I make that scary?" And yeah, I mean that's just what we do. But as far as that worry about technology undermining a game, I don't think that there are that many games where, I mean, let's take a classic example where some keepers or GMs will worry about smartphones, and it's, oh yeah, but how can I keep things mysterious when people can just go online and Google stuff and take a look at maps and so on? And I mean, I've generally found in most games the difficulty I have is getting the information I want into the hands of the players. And if they can pull out a device from their pocket and Google something and learn something truly horrifying that is going to wreck their character's day in a few seconds, I'm all for that. That's great. Let's do that. So yeah, I mean, I love technology from that point of view. Most of the games I run are present day for that reason. Yeah, I really can't see any real objections to using that.
David, again, I don't want to do any spoilers here, but many moons ago, I believe that game we played, you used a bit of technology in that, and I know it was something that was out there. I'll probably say the name of the game, and heads will start nodding. But in Ladybird, Fly Away, in the Things We Leave Behind collection.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a significant. I mean, there's a website, and I remember just kind of in game, getting the link, clicking the link, and going, "What?
Yeah,
this is so immersive. This is incredible." I think I remember actually after that session going into my wife and just kind of going, "You're not going to believe the game I'm playing." I mean, she doesn't play tabletop role-playing games, but she listened because I was so animated and so like, and there was a website, and yeah, it was so powerful, such a powerful. I mean, if we're talking about how technology can reinforce your storytelling, it's like Scott saying as well. It's if you can get your players to do something almost independently of you that then reinforces the horror of the game. It's such a fantastic investment from them.
Yep.
Yeah, actually, along those lines, I mean, one thing I like doing is throwing in real-world details into games, little bits of weird history that might not be, particularly well known. And I have had this crop up in games where sometimes, someone's character is off screen and they'll Google something that's happened, and we'll cut back to them and they'll say, "Hang on, that really happened? Fuck, that's wrong. No, that's bad."
oh yeah.
I mean, I as Newman said, I do like to involve technology as well and utilize it in my favor in order to creep out the players and create and utilize the atmosphere to build with it. But to come to maybe our last topic here, which was another question, is especially on that point. So you're keeping and you're building up the tension throughout one shots, two shots, maybe extended scenarios that take a bit longer. But then you end on this like huge banger, and it's like a really cool finale for that one shot. But then you like the group and you want to continue with them, and you might want to do like a campaign out of this or continuation. How do you maintain or keep the players kind of like on that? Do you want to keep them on the high, or do you want to kind of introduce some kind of downtime that kind of relaxes the atmosphere again? Like, how do you keep tension and atmosphere throughout a transition from a one shot, for example, to a campaign? Is there any tips that you can maybe give?
To use an example from a classic, the Pendragon RPG, which has built-in downtimes in the form of its winter phases, the players remain engaged between their quests. They are still doing things. They're doing the upkeep of their forts, their castles, their settlements, and so forth. But they aren't necessarily at any personal risk. Their families maybe, because you'll be rolling to see whether their children have died of plague or someone's, whatever. It's the Dark Ages, these things happen. Wives come 10 a penny, apparently. But it's a part of maintaining interest in a mechanical way, and narrative, but doesn't actually require players to be terrified. Now, you can do that in any game. It doesn't just have to be Arthurian Knights, that you actually build in downtime where you basically say, so what are you doing right now? And that's all the engagement I feel you need. There may be disagreement, and I would welcome it, but I think it's either... I don't know if it's impossible to maintain a feeling of tension or terror across lots and lots of sessions, but I feel like it would be asking a bit too much of the players, especially if there are big gaps between your games, to return every single night with the same feeling with which they left a week or a month before. But yeah, in-game, I think building downtime in and signposting it as downtime is a good way of getting people to relax, because you can't get back into tension unless you start off from a relaxed point of view. That allows you to jump on them.
Yeah, for me, there's just 2 points there, and I think they both kind of fold very much into what Matthew's saying there. The first one, in terms of having downtime, I think it can be really rewarding, and I think the fact that it is, the literal word downtime, it is a time of a lack of tension and suspense. It is a time where the characters, and I think, let's be honest, if we're playing investigators and if we are moving, or whether we're playing vampires or werewolves or zombie survivors or whatever we're doing, if there's an opportunity for us to see our characters grow through experience points or whatever the system requires it is, to then, I quite like to have a conversation. So what is it that you've done in this time? Have you, are you focusing on something specific? Are you reading that arcane tome that you really shouldn't, or are you watching that person? Are you really following them, or are you practicing how to smash out a zombie's brains, or whatever it is that you're doing to justify those skill rolls, even if it's a roll of skills first and then, well, these are what you've done. Tell me how you've done it. It's that kind of almost backstory flashback role play, isn't it, that you can kind of play with and discuss. And I think that's quite a nice opportunity to allow, in your head and in your players' heads, let people's characters grow so they are more than just those horrific experiences, because then we're slightly more invested and the new horror is going to be even more horrific. But the other aspect is I really like the idea that kind of gone a little bit sideways on what I was going to say now. Come back to me in a minute. I've lost the words. Come back to me in a minute.
Jason or Scott, any comments?
I just basically allow the players to have, like I said, the downtime, because in the quiet moments, when are actually some of the more emotionally resonant moments, that you can let them interact. And what's really scary in horror is when a personality is threatened. You can't really develop a personality if every second is just pure tension. It's the quiet moments where the true personality comes out. For example, in Negative Space, we figured out that all the events took place within the space of 3 days. Narratively, they went through the ringer, but the quiet moments when they were sitting around a table talking about the events that had happened to them, the events that they were going to research, their thoughts and feelings about their family, those really brought the characters out released the tension, but it also gave more agency and investment to them, because when the horrors returned, now these are real people going through real suffering, and they're under real threat, where they're not cutouts anymore. So definitely give the players a moment to rest, reflect, and just be their characters.
Wonderful.
Yeah, that whole thing about investing in your characters is vital to, I think, maybe not so much for one shots, but certainly for campaign play or any kind of extended play, absolutely vital. And I think it kind of helps to think of one shots very much as horror films, and campaigns very much as episodic or series television. And the approach you take to developing tension in each of those is very different. You do get horror films where, yes, there are ebbs and flows of tension. That's most of them. But you get the rare horror film where it just starts out of the gate building tension and never really lets go. And you just feel like you've had a 90-minute panic attack. And those are great. I love horror films like that. And you can absolutely do that in a one-shot. You can't do that in a campaign because, for a start, as I think Matthew was saying, you have breaks between the sessions, so the player's actual emotions dissipate. But also, just storytelling doesn't work like that. Not over a long time. So yeah, I think it's okay to let that tension go. It's just, if there is nothing but tension, you just become inured to it, and it no longer has the punch anymore.
If I may, I might just repeat Scott's words, but slightly less eloquent. The thought I had was this idea of thinking of the audience, or the audience, the investigator, the player, the whatever we're doing with our players, like an elastic band, and in that campaign, like you're saying, you can increase tension, you can hold suspense, but if you take them too far for too long, they get used to it. And the horror dissipates because they're used to that sensation. So relinquishing the tension, dissipating suspense, and then rebuilding it at different paces. It could be sharp, it could be shocking. Scott's talking about there in those short horror films. You can do that. You can get that slow pull, and you can take them on that journey. And that's the whole film, that growing sense of dread, because it's a film. But absolutely in a campaign sense, and Matthew's talking about these breaks in between. You can't hold that because I think we've all said it, in terms of storytelling, it takes away from that storytelling, because you're asking players to take on the mindset, hopefully, of their investigators, their characters, their creations, and re-engage with a feeling that they're not feeling. And the fun of what we do, the catharsism of what we do, is we want them to feel it. So if we're trying to go, can everyone just remember how scared we were? It's not, is it? It's not what we do. Sorry. As I said, I'm saying what Scott said, but just not as good. I think I'll have that on my tombstone, actually.
Yeah, wonderful. I think that is a good point, kind of to wrap this up. As much as I would like to continue that beautiful discussion with you guys, but finally, I would like to ask each of you if you can give kind of like a 30-second piece of advice for keepers, or something that was very valuable to you that you kind of would kind of give new GMs, or something that is, in your eyes, the most important thing while GMing.
For campaigns, try and keep things intimate at first, at least. For the first few sessions, make it intimate. Make it about the characters. Make the horror about the characters. If you're running Vampire the Masquerade, make it about the block they dwell on, not about the entire city full of vampires. Maybe add one NPC vampire. Everyone else is mortal. Everyone else is connected. The players will relate to the subject matter a lot more. They'll get the horror. It will actually stir something in them more than saying, well, here's the Camarilla, here's the Sabbat, here's a world of darkness. that's existential urban fantasy, which is another genre, perfectly fine, but it's not horror. So keep things close and tight around your characters, and you will have a more rewarding horror experience.
I would say, especially within our horror world of gaming that we're talking about, as the keeper, the GM, finds something that not the player, finds something that the characters care about, that they care about, and squeeze. Whether you do that slowly, whether you do that with a sudden clench of the fist, it's as long as the character cares about it and the players are invested, you've got them hooked.
Keep to that. Horror is, like I said, an emotion. It's intimate. You can plan your world and what scares you and just go with that. It's probably going to fall apart unless the players are invested. Try to play upon their fears, try to drag out their emotions, and just basically string them along and just go with their story. Because that's where the real horror is. Their story, their connections.
Oh, I think the one bit of advice I'd offer is to bear in mind that for all we love horror and all we're trying to make our games scary, that horror RPGs are actually very rarely scary things. Players aren't often scared at the table. It happens rarely and you get great moments of it. But on the whole, we're playing these games because we like the genre, we like the feel of it, we like the kind of things it sparks in our imagination. And, ultimately, if we just end up emotionally invested in it but not scared, that's great.
We're building fun houses.
Yeah.
For them to go through.
Yeah,
Those are scary.
the communal storytelling, and I think that's mentioned several times today. The collective campfire, sitting around the campfire and telling creepy story to each other, to kind of have a fun evening, even though that fun is a bit of horror.
Yeah. Communal suffering. There's no fun suffering alone, but there's a lot of fun sharing out.
That is true. Go.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just thinking that in some ways that's why I prefer watching horror movies in a theater, because just that collective, we're all there, and you can actually hear the audience breathe in or crunch into their seat. That's an effective sharing experience. It's just. I mean, that's why I love horror so much. You're all connected.
Yeah,
It's gone in my notebook, Matthew. There's no fun in suffering alone. It's gone in
Unless you're self-flagellant, I'm guessing.
that is true.
A different kind of horror.
But yeah, on that note, I think Jason mentioned a perfect kind of bridge, which is in slot 4.5. We continue maybe a discussion about horror inspiration that comes from film and media, and we can delve in a bit more about what is happening there with Scott, Seth, Jacqueline, Newman, and Jason as well. And I want to thank my guests tonight, Matthew Dawkins, Newman, Jason Fryer, and Scott Dorward. It was fantastic and a pleasure, honor to have you with us at the Illusion HorrorCon. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And
I just enjoyed being around people who have actually scared me. So this is a real honor. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, yeah, thank you. And with that, I think I leave, for those of you who are in games now, a good 5 to 10 minutes to get your bathroom break and continue with slot number 2. Thank you again very much from all of us. And thank you to our guests. Have a wonderful evening, night, day, morning, wherever you are in the world. And hope to see you soon.
Take care.
Bye-bye all.
Good
Bye-bye.
night.
Bye.